Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are talking about citrus aromatics. Oh yes. Citrus aromatics typically comprise a subgenre of Chypre. You've got citrus aromatic Chypres for the most part. There are some citrus aromatic fougères, and we will talk about the few cases where I feel like the citrus aromatic genre sort of tips over into fougère territory, whether intentionally or maybe unintentionally, but it happens. However, as a sort of genre in and of itself, whether you want to consider it an official genre or more of a trope, right? Things tend to run in tropes these days because they're not long-lived enough to realize themselves as genre, like the old days. But however you consider the phenomenon that is the citrus aromatic fragrance, it's a category I like to enjoy in the lead up to summer. Once we're in the very hottest of months, where it is downright unpleasant outside, then it becomes really anyone's guess what I manage to put on my skin. Citrus aromatics can still play a role in that situation, but when you're in a really hot environment, especially one where there's a certain level of humidity, everything kind of sweats off of you. And that situation in particular, when you're outside in that kind of weather, things of a more synthetic nature tend to do a little better, which I know this wasn't an option 40, 50 years ago, but it is now. So a lot of the aquatics and ozonic things that have heavy amounts of aldehydes, dihydromercenol, ambroxan, kalone, lots of different sharp synthetic metallic musky elements, things that pierce the air, things that are very bracing in the nose, those are probably the best things to wear when it's 85, 90 degrees Fahrenheit and higher, or if you're using Celsius like in the 30s, right? You climb into the 30s with Celsius, and that's the kind of weather where you break out your aquatics, your ozonic stuff. Things like Sauvage that have the tenacity of spent nuclear fuel, right? But in the lead-up months, right, we're talking about when it's anywhere from upper 60s to upper 70s, that's like the golden spot for the citrus aromatic. And I think by and large, most of them are patterned after that particular climate anyway, like the Mediterranean, okay, places where you don't get extreme amounts of heat, but you do find cool breeze coming off the water and warm sunlight, and they mix together. So you have instances of a cool breeze blowing, but then you've also got the warmth of the sun and shade here and there. That sort of aesthetic is really the food stuff of the citrus aromatic. It's the stuff that really inspires the creation of those fragrances. And the citrus aromatic goes all the way back before there were proper fougères and Chypres, because technically speaking, the earliest eau de colognes were citrus aromatic, okay? 4711, Farina, okay? Roger and Gallet, Guerlain, Cologne de Imperial. These were all citrus aromatics because they have citrus as their primary top note and aromatics as their primary heart and base material. Now, the colognes didn't have proper bases as we understand them today. No musks, no oak moss really, nothing like that. But they had wood essences and they had herbs, which if you're a bartender, if you're someone who likes cocktails, you understand that herbal creations that are put into certain drinks are called aromatics. Certain cocktails call for the addition of aromatics to the drink. So it's a familiar, it's cross terminology, people. Once we started getting into proper perfumes, right, and we saw the fougère and the Chypre both shimmer into existence, then we saw the citrus aromatic get a little more base heavy. We would see oak moss, primarily sandalwood or cedarwood or both. We would see labdanum. Labdanum has a really big part to play. Cistus itself, the rock rose, the Cistus labdanum flower, has a big part to play because Cistus labdanum pairs really well with bergamot oil with lemon oil, okay, with orange oil. Because of its nature, it has a very pasty, sort of smooth, slightly musky profile to it that really is adjacent, in an olfactive sense, adjacent to the citrus oils. And then everything else along the way, the sandalwood, the cedarwood, various herbal materials like basil, like tarragon, okay, all of these things, rosemary, sage, they all kind of just work with the citrus. And you don't need a whole lot of else going on. You can put some geranium in there. You can put a tiny bit of lavender in there. We've seen that happen before. I wouldn't call a citrus aromatic that has lavender and geranium a fougere, honestly, because it's missing all the other key ingredients. No tonka, really. Oak moss is there, but without the tonka, you don't get the hay-like effect, right? So it's a bit hit or miss. There's a couple things that would, could be fougere adjacent, but still within the realm of the chypre. And then, of course, last but not least, we see a lot of citrus aromatics tend to play around with musk profiles, once musks came into the equation, that don't really interfere with the display of the citrus. So certain natural musks like civet are sour in tone, so they go great with citruses, right, when dosed judiciously. And then, of course, leather materials like isobutylquinoline, right, or aka pyrrolone, another sour material, works really well with a bright citrus top. And then, of course, ambergris, salty, a little bit breathy, works really well with bergamot, a little bit of geranium, right? One of my favorite custom blended fragrances made for me, all right, by Perfumes. It's named after me. It's called Draco Ridari, and it's basically bergamot, rose, and ambergris, and it was really, it's more to it than that, but those are the primary things that pop out of my head. And it just really encapsulates what a citrus aromatic is supposed to be in my eyes. So go check her out on Instagram, Vareo Perfumes, all right? Or you can look on my Instagram and you'll see my post of the fragrance she made for me. Now, citrus aromatics probably peaked in popularity, I want to say, in the mid-20th century. So the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, that's when the genre peaked. And it's because during the whole pre-war era and then the World War II era leading up to the 50s, the prevailing masculine style was the fougere. And thanks to increased wet shaving habits, shaved cream and such, the fougere began to move away from the green elements that it had originally and began to get more vanillic and more rounded, full of clove, okay, full of carnation, full of heliotrope, really powdery, really sweet. And guys started to kind of push back against that. They wanted more of that tart, strong, forthright, patriarchal sense of masculinity. Can't be sweet, can't be floral, can't be spicy. It has to be straight, like a punch to the jaw. And well, what do you know? The citrus aromatics seem to be perfect for that, because bergamot is not sweet. Oak moss is not sweet. Sandalwood is typically not sweet. Geranium, which usually ended up in the hearts of these, a little bit of rose sometimes even, again, not sweet. None of these things are sweet. Not spicy, and the musk profiles being typically sour, tart, leathery musk profiles were also not pleasant, not pillowy, not puffy, not soft. So the citrus aromatic reigned supreme in that square-jawed, slicked back hair, let down shoulders, that whole 1950s like this. It was the era for that. And some of the best were made in that era, okay? Some of the best were. Once we start getting into the 80s and perfumes got much louder and more complex, 70s really into the 80s, both stuff that was marketed to men and women, and of course the non-gendered stuff as well, what little bit of it there was back then, not much. Really complex, really big, bold, lots of aldehydes, lots of musks and florals. For both men and women, didn't really matter, okay? The fragrances just got really off the chain in that time. And a lot of vintage enthusiasts, okay, a lot of the vintage people loved that era. I understand why you love it. But the citrus aromatic genre really took a hit because it wasn't fashionable, because they're not strong fragrances, right? Typically not very complex. So they were like snore, snooze fest. I want to wear Koros. I want to wear Giorgio. I want to wear Poison. I want to wear something like that. I want to wear Antaeus. I don't want to wear a basic Chypre. I don't want to wear something like Monsieur de Givenchy was out of style by the 80s, right? So there you have it. And then, of course, the restrictions on the materials. Sandalwood was the first to go by the early to mid 90s. Then once IFRA started to really crack down on oak moss and other materials, okay, it got really difficult to make a citrus aromatic fragrance since the citrus oils are restricted, the oak moss is restricted, the sandalwood's not available anymore. So it's like, what do you do? So a lot of houses just moved on and began making more abstract, fresh fragrances. The aquatic, which was already taking over, seemed like a perfect replacement. So it just kind of slid right on in and took over. Something like Armani Eau pour Homme was too difficult to produce with a high quality. So Acqua di Gio, perfect. Acqua di Gio comes right in, takes its place. They both were sold side by side for a while, but a lot of people will tell you those later era bottles of the Armani Eau pour Homme were just not the snuff compared to what it was before, because the materials just weren't there. These days, there are enough good replacements. There are enough good rectified oak moss materials, rectified bergamot oil. There's enough stuff out there that can pass muster that you can actually make a decent citrus aromatic, but you run into a new problem. And the new problem is that these fragrances have been off the market for so long, no one has a taste for them anymore. It's like chocolate malts. Chocolate malts were everywhere in the 50s. People loved malted candies too, Maltesers, Whoppers, everywhere. But these products just kind of went away and people lost their taste for them. And now if you were to just introduce a brand new product with malt in it, like a brand new malt flavored candy bar, like if Snickers had a chocolate malt, nobody would buy it. It's not because everyone hates it, it's because no one really knows what it is. No one really knows what a chocolate malt is anymore. It's just not a thing. That's kind of what we have now with the citrus aromatic fragrances, is they've been off the market for so long that if someone were to introduce one and were able to make a high quality version of it with rectified materials that pass all of the regulations, it wouldn't sell. It just wouldn't sell. People don't have a taste for it. You'd have to somehow get people to have a taste for it again. And with everything being so sweet and so abstract and so candy-like and so full of all this other stuff, I don't know. It's a stiff proposition. I won't say never. I will not say never, but it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. It's one of those things where people just would not gravitate towards it because they would need to be taught what it is, right? It's been gone for so long. So for those of us who've held on to the flame, who love the citrus aromatics and still love them to this day, right? You've clung in there this whole time. You and me are on the same page. And now it's time for me to tell you what some of my favorites are. This last 10 minutes of the video, I'll go over my favorite citrus aromatics. So, starting all the way back in like 1911, okay, 1911, we have a little fragrance called Chevalier d'Orsay by Parfums d'Orsay. And Chevalier d'Orsay is a citrus aromatic sheep before the sheep genre actually existed in modern perfumery. So it's like a proto-sheep, I guess. It's not technically one. But the thing about Chevalier d'Orsay is it's one of those early masculine fragrances that wasn't made exclusively for men. It didn't say Chevalier d'Orsay pour Homme, right? But the name Chevalier itself, right? It's typically a male role. So it was more or less a knight on a horse on the original bottles. So it sort of implied who it was for. The audience was implied, not necessarily defined. And the fragrance is primarily citrus, bergamot oils, okay? It's got a lot of wormwood in it, so I hope you like Artemisia, because you're going to get a lot of Artemisia in this fragrance. It's got a little bit of lavender, very judicious amount of lavender, labdanum, oak moss. It's surprisingly floral and herbal for most fragrances in this genre, but that's because it's so early on. It was made so early on. It doesn't follow many of the templates we expect now, okay? So it's not bizarre, okay? It still smells like a citrus aromatic, but when you smell it, you're like, huh, that's definitely different, right? Like the familiar building blocks are there, but then there's something else there too that makes it unique, and I love it. It's great. Following that up, well, not a whole lot of good, high-quality citrus aromatic fragrances until we get to that 40s, 50s era again. They just weren't super popular. But the Italians seem to love them. So a lot of the best ones, if they're not French, are invariably Italian, right? And I give a shout out to Blend and Bouquet, which also came out around the turn of the century. Blend and Bouquet is also a citrus aromatic. It relies very heavily on lime and black pepper. So if you like that sort of thing, you'd probably like it too, but it's expensive because Penhaligon's is expensive. British fragrance. But fast forward to the 40s, and we would see a couple of really good ones. Victor, aka Visconti di Madrone in Italy, but in America we knew it as Victor. Now it goes by the name all over the world, Visconti di Madrone, but for a while the Anglophone market was Victor, and it was only called Visconti di Madrone in Italy. But it's the same company. Victor just is what you'll find on the older bottles if you're in the US or the UK. Now, their fragrance, Acqua di Selva, 1947. It's one of the rare cases where it's a citrus aromatic that tiptoes into fougere territory. And the reason why I say that, it has lavender, it has geranium, it has oak moss and tonka and bergamot. That's the key building blocks of a fougere. Lavender, lavender, geranium, bergamot, oak moss, tonka. It has all those things. But what really keeps it from being a typical fougere is the balancing of the ingredients. It has a lot of lemon in it, a lot of lemon, and a lot of pine, and a lot of oak moss. So the actual lavender geranium core is reduced. It is really like, it's shaped like this. Like take like something and then scoop out the middle like this. So it's like a dumbbell, right? So really heavy oak moss, really heavy pine in the base, really heavy lemon and herbs, and then the actual fougere part is minimized. The lavender geranium part's minimized. It's really all about the citrus, all about the herbs and the woods. And that's why, even though it's technically a fougere, I consider Acqua di Selva a citrus aromatic, but also a fougere too. Then we've got Moustache by Rochas. Moustache by Rochas is classified as a fougere if you follow Michael Edwards. And he's someone that I respect, so I respectfully disagree with him. I think it feels more like a chypre. However, I will put an asterisk next to the original cologne. The original cologne in its original form was very heavy on lavender, very rich, would feel like a fougere to someone, right? But the eau de toilette with the red label that came out a little bit later, the blue label was the cologne. The eau de toilette was rebalanced towards citrus, rebalanced towards woods, much more sour, much more musky, much sharper, and thus pulls towards the chypre genre. Even if it, like Acqua di Selva, contains all the key ingredients to be a fougere. So Moustache is a weird fragrance created by Edmund Rudnitska and his wife, Therese. The only fragrance that Therese Rudnitska was actually credited on, right, with her husband. Weird fragrance. It exists in both areas simultaneously, the fougere and the chypre. Now, into the 50s, we've got a lot of good ones, okay? This video is running out of time, so I can't spend too much longer on these. But in the 50s, you've got like the Holy Trinity. Chanel Pour Monsieur, okay? Monsieur de Givenchy, and then of course, technically not in the 50s, but 1961, we would see Monsieur Lanvin. That's like the Holy Trinity of the early citrus aromatics. The Americans had some good ones too. Okay, you had That Man by Revlon, really nice. You had Ardent for Men Sandalwood, also really nice. All that mid-50s, late 50s. Now, it's a kind of a toss-up which one I like more, whether I like the Chanel one more or I like the Givenchy one more. It really goes back and forth. The Chanel one by Henry Robert is very plush. Chanel Pour Monsieur, very plush, very round. Petitgrain is the focus of that fragrance. But the Givenchy one is much more of the classic citrus, and it really has that soapy, clean sandalwood feeling to it that the Chanel doesn't have. The Chanel relies more on oak moss, whereas the Givenchy relies more on sandalwood. So it's really a toss-up. I like them both. It's Coke and Pepsi, and I drink both Coke and Pepsi. So I have both Chanel Pour Monsieur in large quantities and Monsieur de Givenchy in large quantities. They're both great. Can't really decide which one I like more. And then we've got the big ones in the 60s. We've got Eau Sauvage, another Rudnitska fragrance. This one goes far more floral because it has a heavy dose of jasmine hedione, and the jasmine hedione really defined Eau Sauvage when it came out in 66. But it still qualifies as a citrus aromatic. And then in 67, we would see Roberto Capucci release Capucci Pour Homme, which that puts a unique leather twist. So it takes the basic thing that we had with Monsieur de Givenchy, the thing we had with That Man by Revlon, the thing we had with Chanel Pour Monsieur, with Moustache Rochas, right? It takes that idea, but then it adds leather in the base. It adds a really sour isobutyl-quinoline pyrrolone base note that takes it in a different direction. And I like Capucci Pour Homme a lot. It's very good. Then we get 1971, and what do we see in 71? Yves Saint Laurent Pour Homme from 1971, or YSL Pour Homme. This is a very thick, labdanum heavy take on the citrus aromatic. It has lots of lemon in it, but it goes very heavy on the labdanum. It's very musky, but it's also creamy. It's creamy because it has a bit of, again, of a fougere twist in the base, in the heart, actually, not the base. It's got a fougere twist in the heart. It's got lavender geranium, a little bit of clove in there to give it a creamy feeling, and then it hits you with the labdanum, it hits you with the civet musk, with the oak moss. It's a very thick take on the citrus aromatic genre, but it's pretty good. And then, of course, Guerlain would come into the fray in 74 with Eau de Guerlain. And Eau de Guerlain is also more on the floral side, like Eau Sauvage, a bit more floral, but a bit more herbal. Citruses still play a large role in the fragrance, but you'd be mistaken into thinking it was a rose scent because of how it's balanced. We also get Gucci Pour Homme, the original Gucci Pour Homme from 76. Kind of an outlier. They weren't doing a whole lot of citrus aromatic fragrances in the 70s. Wasn't really popular then. But we do get Gucci Pour Homme. Very nice. Very heavy on sandalwood, though. You've got to be a sandalwood fan to like that fragrance. And then moving into the 80s, I've already mentioned Armani Eau Pour Homme. Fantastic fragrance. Another classic citrus aromatic. Bergamot, okay, herbs, oak moss, sandalwood. Gianfranco Fair for Man would come out in 86. Really heavy again on the woods. The Italian citrus aromatics tend to go more aromatic than citrus. Going all the way back to Acqua di Selva, they tend to go more aromatic. The citrus is more of a prelude, and then you get hit with all the woods. And the same thing with Gianfranco Fair. You get hit with all the woods, right? Very, very woody fragrance. Very much you're climbing the Alps, you know, in North Italy, climbing into the mountains there. It's what you do with that fragrance. And then, of course, things will begin thinning out, but we'd have Eau de Rochas in the early 90s, another good citrus aromatic that's very lemony, has lots of herbs. And then, of course, the fragrance I'm wearing today, which I will stop the video here, is none other than Homme de Grès from 96. A real late entry into the whole thing before, you know, Ifra killed the genre off. But it's also worth exploring. Hope you enjoyed watching. Catch you next time.